Hello, and welcome to another Frankfort Civil War Roundtable with the Paul Sawyer Public Library. Tonight, we have Kentucky author Brad Asher with us. And as always, we have Mr. Charles Bogart, who is the organizer of the Frankfort Civil War Roundtable, and he will be introducing our speaker tonight. If you haven't already, if you would go ahead and mute yourself, just out of respect to our speakers this evening. And then at the end of the presentation, feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions that you might have. Also, if you have questions during the presentation or even at the end, if you feel more comfortable, do feel free to type in your questions or comments in the chat. All right. We're going to go ahead and get started tonight. Glad to see everyone with us on this dreary evening. Let's see here. Okay, we got another person joining us. Great. All right. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Charles Bogart to introduce our speaker this evening. Charles.
Okay, thank you, Diane. As she said, this is a presentation of the Paul Sawyer Public Library, the Capital City Museum, and the Frankfort Civil War Roundtable. It's a long story why the Frankfort Franklin County Library is called the Paul Sawyer Library, but that's for another time. Brad Asher, I met him, 2 months ago, I guess, over in Lexington. Fascinating gentleman, fascinating talk. He has his doctorate degree from the University of Chicago. He's taught all around the country. He's been a lad-fi going from here to there. Settled here in Kentucky and got interested in the most hated man in Kentucky, General Stephen Burbridge. I'm out in Newport, Fort Thomas, Northern Kentucky. When I moved down here to Frankfort 50 some odd years ago, I found out that my knowledge of the Civil War was totally wrong. And the farther west I went in Kentucky, the more I learned how totally wrong my understanding of the history of Kentucky was. Particularly when Butcher Burbridge was raised in that. So tonight we're going to talk about this gentleman, and does he deserve the bad name that many in Kentucky have assigned to him, or is he a victim of the lost cause? So Brad, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Charles. And thanks, Diane, for setting this up. And thanks to the Sawyer Public Library for holding it. And thanks to everybody who logged in tonight and is willing to listen to me yammer on about my book. I am going to share my screen, which has a PowerPoint presentation. So all I will be is a little head in the corner of your screen, probably. And then that's always a little clunky on Zoom. So hopefully this works. Okay, hopefully you can all see that and it's on your screen. Great. So yeah, like Charles pointed out, this is an attempt to reconsider the most hated man in Kentucky, which is the title of my book. And when you publish a book called The Most Hated Man in Kentucky, one of the good things about that title is it encourages people to guess who they think it is, because no one reads subtitles, of course. They just see The Most Hated Man in Kentucky and they go, oh, I bet it's about. So several people, as you might expect in these polarized times, have guessed some of our current politicians, although the person they guessed I rapidly learned that the person they guessed depended on the partisan leanings of the person doing the guessing. And also another popular guess, which I guess is because I must have asked or talked to a lot of UK fans, another popular guest was Christian Laettner, the former Duke University basketball player, all of which is incorrect. But no one guessed Stephen Burbridge. And in some way, I guess that stands to reason, because Burbridge, after decades of being despised by Kentuckians, has by now sunk into relative obscurity, known mostly to historians and folks like you who are interested in the Civil War in Kentucky. But if you had been alive in the last few decades of the 19th century, there would have been little doubt that Burbridge held the title of most hated man. And to give you a flavor of how Kentuckians thought about him, I'm just going to read a little bit of a short sampling of some of the commentary on Burbridge from newspapers and politicians. And these stem from the late 1860s through mid 1880s, roughly. One writer called him a paupered, lecherous, despised, and criminal outcast, and predicted he would forever be denied rest in the hereafter. The governor at the time, during the war, or right after the war, Thomas Bramlett, called him an imbecile with a weak intellect and an overwhelming vanity. Various newspapers at times called him a blood-stained tyrant, a demon in human shape. One newspaper writer lamented that someone he knew was a Christian because that gentleman had failed to gun down Burbridge when they had met in Washington. So he was not well liked. Now, this hatred of Burbridge grew out of his time when he was military commander of the District of Kentucky. And that lasted from March 1864 to February 1865. And during that time, he banned certain books and periodicals. He interfered in Kentucky's elections and its economy. He banished and arrested dissenters. And probably most notably, he executed prisoners in retaliation for acts that they had not committed. For these and other reasons, most white Kentuckians by the end of the war had come to loathe him. And on its face, you could say that they were justified in their loathing. We don't these days tend to favor clampdowns on civil liberties or election interference by the military or summary executions. But the informal title of this talk, as you might have noticed from the title slide, is Reconsidering Stephen Burbridge. And as Charles said, what we're going to try and do is see if he was really as big a bastard as his Black reputation suggests. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to look closely at the context in which his actions were taken, and we're going to question the motives of some of those who were eager to fan the flames of hatred against him. And that's what I'm going to do in this talk, and it's what I've tried to do at more length in the book. So let me give you a little bit of background on Burbridge. This is just a little casual one-generation family tree that I put together. So he was born in Scott County to a well-off family. They were slave owners. Stephen was a slave owner. So he was a son of bluegrass elites, essentially. His father's farm was one of the most valuable operations in Scott County in 1850. And then Stephen relocated to Logan County in his 20s during the 1850s. And it was there that he recruited the 26th Kentucky Infantry Regiment very early in the war from the Logan County area. And he pretty quickly moved up the ranks of the Union Army. He made brigadier general in June 1862 and went on to participate in the Vicksburg campaign. And he seemed generally to have been a competent commander who earned the respect of his men and the praise of his commanding officers. And then he was officially named commander of the Military District of Kentucky on March 25th, 1864. So that date is pretty important if the goal is to put Burbridge's actions in context. Because in March of 1864, Kentucky was a mess, kind of a mess, a big mess. It was, of course, a Union state formally, but it had a sizable number of Confederate sympathizers among its white population. And it was subject to an increasing number of attacks from guerrillas and Confederate cavalry raiders, and support for the Union cause was wavering among influential Unionist elites. So this was the situation in which Burbridge took command. So it's the conflict among Kentucky's Unionists that I kind of want to talk about first. In our day, I think there's a tendency to associate the Union with abolition and with anti-slavery, but many of Kentucky's Unionists were pro-Union and pro-slavery. In fact, they were pro-Union because they were pro-slavery. They had argued against secession in 1860 because they felt that the best way to preserve slavery in Kentucky was to stay in the Union. After all, the federal government had protected slavery up to that point through law and policy, and to secede would mean to lose that protection and probably to lose slavery. And they won that argument. Kentucky did not secede, it stayed in the Union. And most Unionist slaveholders expected that the federal government would not endanger their slave property. So the Emancipation Proclamation caused them to question that confidence. The proclamation did not really touch Kentucky directly, and the provision that allowed enslaved people to enlist in the Union Army did not apply in Kentucky. But nonetheless, the idea of emancipation was deeply unsettling to the slaveholders in Kentucky. And then, or rather, I should say, by early 1864, Kentucky was unique among Union states in that it was exempted from the federal law that allowed Black enrollment and enlistment in the Army. And as you know, if under the terms of the law, the federal law, if a slave enlisted in the Army, he was free. He was granted his freedom. But this order was not functional in Kentucky. The Lincoln administration decided it would be too controversial to implement it in Kentucky, and so they did not. As a result, several thousand Black Kentuckians left the state and enlisted in neighboring states in order to take advantage of the provision of the law that gained them their freedom for enlisting. So this situation, Kentucky's situation, changed in February of 1864, just as Burbridge was taking command. Congress amended the Enrollment Act and ended Kentucky's exemption from Black enlistment. Soon after that, Kentucky failed to meet its draft quota with white troops, and as a result, Burbridge issued General Order number 34 in April, which instructed provost marshals in each district to, quote, receive and regularly enlist as soldiers all able-bodied Negro slaves and free colored persons of lawful age, if they wanted to serve. Now, Order number 34 was hemmed in by certain qualifications and some ambiguous language regarding permission of the owner, but African Americans flocked to the recruiting centers seeking their freedom, and that their numbers pretty much blew apart all the ambiguities and the restrictions that had been put into that order. So there was a tremendous negative reaction to these developments among Kentucky's white Unionists, and a pronounced division developed between conservative Unionists and unconditional Unionists. Conservative Unionists wanted no alteration of the initial bargain under which they had entered the war. They supported the Union and the defeat of the Southern Rebellion, but they did not support emancipation or any interference with slave property. Their motto, their rallying cry, if you will, was the Union as it was and the Constitution as it is. So no changes in the way it had worked. Unconditional Unionists, on the other hand, were willing to follow federal wartime policy wherever it led. If the defeat of the Confederacy required an assault on slave owning, then so be it. Preservation of the Union and restoration of the nation took precedence over a commitment to maintaining slavery. So Burbridge was on the side of the unconditional Unionists, but he hadn't started there, and he did not start the war committed to emancipation. He was not an abolitionist from the start. In fact, early in the war, he was criticized by more abolitionist-minded soldiers from northern states because he would return escaping slaves that came into his lines back to their owners. Of course, these were Unionist owners, and that was the policy of the Army at the time, was to return enslaved people back to owners if the owners were loyal. But when that policy changed, which it had by February 1864, and when Burbridge was serving as commander of Kentucky, he was willing, as previous commanders had not been, to endanger slavery for the sake of the Union cause. And so when he was charged with implementing the enrollment and enlistment of Kentucky's slaves, he issued Order Number 34. And he followed through on that. He threatened punishment of those who tried to prevent Blacks from signing up. And he used Black troops in the field, like the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry, which was recruited in Kentucky. He used them for garrison duty. And most galling of all to white Kentuckians, he used them for recruitment, sending them on to plantations and farms to recruit Black workers away to join the Army. He put the abolition-minded James Brisbane in charge of Black recruitment and in charge of the 5th, and he cracked down on conservative Unionists who publicly complained about the policy. Now, one of the most prominent conservative Unionists was Frank Wolford. And many of you may know Wolford's story because he really is, he's a war hero, a genuine Union war hero. He was wounded 7 times in battle. He was active in over 300 skirmishes. He was known as the most dogged pursuer of John Hunt Morgan, so much so that when Morgan was finally brought to bay in Ohio in 1863, after his raid through Kentucky and up into Ohio and Indiana, he sought out Wolford to offer his surrender. But Wolford could not countenance the idea of Black soldiers. In a speech in Lexington, he denounced Lincoln as a tyrant, called the enrollment of African Americans a violation of Kentuckians' guaranteed rights, and said any federal enrolling officer should be arrested under Kentucky's slavery statutes. He even offered up the services of his own men, his own regiment, to back up state officials if they would make these arrests. The governor, Thomas Bramlett, who I previously mentioned, also a Union veteran and a man who had actually pushed for Burbridge to be appointed as commander, he sat alongside Wolford as he made those threats in that speech. And Bramlett himself considered issuing a call to Kentuckians to sue recruiters and pursue criminal proceedings in state courts against federal officers that dared to interfere with slave property, promising that he would bring the whole power of the Commonwealth to bear in these proceedings. Now, he never issued that call. He was talked down from that position by Burbridge and by others during an all-night meeting, but he went on to continually complain about Black enlistment and the way it was carried out, and declared at one point that, quote, truly loyal men are not willing that the status of the Negro shall be made a condition of the restoration of the government. So I think that statement by Bramlett kind of inadvertently gets at the nub of the problem in 1864. What did truly loyal mean in Kentucky? For Wolford and Bramlett and many others, it meant a commitment to ending the Southern Rebellion, and then you were done, full stop. Bring the Southern states back into the Union, but respect their existing property rights, including the right to own other people. Loyalty, in other words, meant a commitment, as I said, to the Union as it was. Now, unconditional Unionists viewed this as insufficient. The meaning of loyalty had changed by 1864, they argued, and the nature of the war had changed. Restoration of the Union and ending slavery had become linked objectives. You weren't going to get one without the other. And both were now bedrock aims of the war. So loyalty meant a commitment to both. In Kentucky, then, acceptance of Black enlistment becomes a kind of shorthand for loyalty to the Union. In one of the loyalty oaths required of military contractors in Kentucky, for example, the stipulations were not only that you had not given any aid or comfort to the Confederacy, but also that you would faithfully support the acts of Congress and proclamations of the president having reference to slaves. Here's another example on your screen of a loyalty oath. This is for shippers who want to ship goods out of and into the state of Kentucky. And you can see that first question, do you ardently desire the success of the federal over the Confederate arms? But then the second question is really the kind of additional notion of loyalty that has come into effect by 1864. Will you faithfully sustain all the measures of the United States government to suppress the rebellion, including the enlistment of slaves in the US Army? Now, Wolford, who was dishonorably discharged, eventually arrested 4 times, called to Washington and dressed down personally by Lincoln, he was once offered a deal in which all the charges against him would be dropped if he pledged not to do or say anything that would hinder the employment and use of colored persons as soldiers. So clearly, loyalty and the understanding of what it meant to be a unionist included this idea that you would not oppose or declaim against the enrollment of African Americans in the Army. Wolford refused the offer, saying he would die in prison before he accepted it. Nonetheless, conservative unionists loudly and regularly proclaimed that they were very loyal, unconditionally loyal, they said, to the Union, and claimed that they were merely exercising their First Amendment rights to speak freely and criticize the government. And they went on to denounce Lincoln. They went on to reject the idea of Black troops, and they went on to criticize emancipation as a war aim. And many of them, as you might expect, campaigned for George McClellan in the November 1864 presidential election. Now, to Burbridge and his military higher-ups, and to Kentucky's unconditional unionists in general, these actions looked an awful lot like disloyalty. Specifically, Wolford and his ilk were discouraging enlistments, sapping morale, emboldening rebels and guerrillas, prolonging the war, in other words. Now, if we just take one of those, discouraging enlistments, that was illegal under federal law, and the state had a similar law on its books. Also, under Kentucky's Disloyal and Treasonable Practices Act, it was illegal to speak or write against the government of the United States in a way that excited insurrection or rebellion. In Burbridge's eyes, the actions of his opponents excited insurrection by encouraging the enemies of the government. One of Burbridge's complaints about Governor Bramlett was that the civil authorities in the state weren't enforcing this law. And as the military commander of Kentucky, Burbridge felt it was his duty to do so. And as a result, he instructed his officers to arrest those who publicly opposed Black enlistment and denounced emancipation. Some of them he threw in jail, some were banished beyond the Confederate lines, and some had to put up peace bonds as tokens of their pledge to stay quiet. Burbridge and his officers also barred certain people from running for public office because of their public stance against these policies, and because they needed cooperative local officials in place, because those local officials would compile the rolls of those who were eligible for enlistment, and they would keep tabs on Confederate sympathy in their districts. Now, Burbridge's critics fired back that many of the arrests, especially of the more prominent conservative figures, were done for partisan purposes to help Lincoln's reelection. And it is clear, if you look particularly at the timing, that partisan motivations played a part in the arrests and the eventual release of some of the detainees. But as even Lincoln said, he would have heard of a lot more arrests in Kentucky if people were arrested merely for opposing his reelection. As I'm sure most of you know, Lincoln lost Kentucky pretty handily to McClellan. And Burbridge continued to make arrests even after the election for speeches that he deemed treasonable, showing that his motivations were not strictly partisan. And it was indeed these arrests after the election was over that finally led Bramlett to petition Lincoln formally for Burbridge's removal. So historians have long criticized Burbridge for his clampdown on political expression and civil liberties, and they have lamented his lack of tact and forbearance, and they have suggested that these policies were to blame for white Kentuckians' alienation from the Union cause. And they've argued that a smoother man at the top, administering the state with a gentler hand, would have had greater success. But I think this is why examining the context of these policies is so important, and understanding the situation in which they were enacted. Unionist disenchantment with the war was not the result of Burbridge's policies. Rather, Burbridge's policies grew out of Unionist disenchantment, specifically disenchantment with the turn towards emancipation. It's hard, at least for me, it's hard to see what policies Burbridge could have followed that could have brought conservative Unionists back into the fold, short of taking emancipation off the table, which is in fact what conservative Unionists wanted. He was the commander of the state. He was ordered to control the expression of disloyal sentiments within his jurisdiction, and he did his duty. And he's been well hated by white Kentuckians for it ever since. So I've not yet talked about the executions that were ordered by Burbridge. And I argue in the book that the critics of the executions need to be analytically separated from the critics of the crackdown on civil liberties. The latter were largely fellow Unionists who complained about Burbridge's policies as they were happening. These people, the targets who were arrested and their friends and allies, they disparaged Burbridge for his interference with free expression and state politics, but they mostly gave him a pass on the executions. After all, at the time, thousands of men were still dying on battlefields across the South, and the death of a few dozen military prisoners, guerrillas, in the hands of the army was no big deal. Critics of the executions, by contrast, were largely returned Confederates and Confederate sympathizers who vilified Burbridge after the war. And while they certainly weren't silent about the civil liberties issues, they consistently attacked Butcher Burbridge, attaching that nickname to him, for his military murders, and they did so for generations after the war. So first, I want to talk about the why and the how of Burbridge's anti-guerrilla policies, and then I want to look at the criticism of those policies that led to this campaign. So Burbridge's problem was one that has faced other Union commanders and commanders in other wars waged by the United States. How do you fight an insurgency? Guerrillas were attacking Unionist civilians and federal troops and government infrastructure. They joined Confederate cavalry raids, and afterwards they often slipped back into the civilian ranks, aided by numerous sympathizers within the larger white population. Moreover, the number of attacks was steadily ticking up during Burbridge's tenure during 1864, especially the second half of 1864, after Burbridge defeated John Hunt Morgan at Cynthiana in June. As Morgan's force disintegrated after that battle, some of his men followed Morgan back to Virginia, but a significant proportion of them stayed in Kentucky and decided to kind of create havoc on what they called detached duty, a kind of freelance guerrilla activity. Without troops, Burbridge did not have sufficient troops to garrison and protect every vulnerable site in the state. And with deep, deep distrust between federal and state officials over the loyalty of the state militia, Burbridge relied on a mass and chase strategy when reports came in about guerrilla activity. And what that means is an attack would occur, and Burbridge would dispatch a squad from a nearby post to try and find and chase the offenders. Or he would pull soldiers from various posts and concentrate his forces to deal with the biggest threat. The guerrillas almost always had the upper hand, and they always had the initiative. So in July, he settled on a new strategy to deter guerrilla attacks, and he issued Order Number 59. This order, as you can see, if you'll read that last sentence, or I'm going to read the last sentence so you can just listen. Whenever an unarmed Union citizen is murdered, 4 guerrillas will be selected from the prisoners in the hands of the military authorities and publicly shot to death in the most convenient place near the scene of the outrage. So over 60 people were killed through the workings of Order Number 59. Now, I want to make it clear that those killed were not responsible for the attack that had resulted in the death of the Union citizen. They had been apprehended for other reasons, for being a Confederate soldier kept behind the lines and away from his unit, for belonging to a guerrilla band that federal troops had captured, or for just threatening or attacking Unionist civilians independently, kind of on their own. But at some point, they had been picked up by federal soldiers, given some sort of cursory investigation, and forwarded to Louisville or Lexington or some other military prison where they were held. Now, Burbridge, he did not leave behind a lot of papers, and he therefore never laid out his thinking behind Order Number 59. But I think we can discern the logic behind it. Guerrillas would refrain from attacks if they knew that the result would be the death of their comrades. Of course, the problem with that logic is that not all guerrillas were comrades. Some leaders of irregular forces operating in Kentucky did make overtures to save their own men, but they didn't really care about the other men in federal custody. The guerrillas were not operating in a coordinated way, and they weren't sharing tactics and strategies. And the idea that public executions of other people would deter them was wrong. And so if you judge it on the grounds of effectiveness only, Order 59 was a failure, and guerrilla attacks were not curtailed. But Burbridge's post-war critics didn't attack Order Number 59 because it was ineffective. They attacked it as a cruel and arbitrary violation of the laws of civilized warfare. In the words of Basil Duke, who was Morgan's second in command, and who, through his writings, was instrumental in fashioning a pro-Confederate lost cause view of the war in Kentucky, Burbridge was an insensate bloodhound who shot all the prisoners he could lay his hands on. So I want to focus on 2 of the main issues that Burbridge's critics brought up when they talked about the executions. The first is the lack of due process for those executed. Burbridge maintained until the end of his days that the men who were killed had been subjected to trial before a military commission. Now, a military commission is like a court-martial. It's a little less informal. It's mainly meant to try enemy combatants for violations of the laws of war, rather than your own soldiers for violations of military law. But proceedings before a military commission were supposed to be pretty formal. They were meant to be formally impaneled with officers. The proceedings were supposed to be written down. The decisions were supposed to be approved by a commander. And then the records are supposed to be forwarded to Washington for review by the Judge Advocate General. It is safe to say that most of the time, for the men held by Burbridge as guerrillas, none of that happened. And when he was challenged to produce the records of the military commissions that he said occurred, Burbridge did not do it. And no scholar, nobody who's looked at it, myself included, has located any of the formal records in the archives, with a couple of notable and important exceptions. What we have instead are hints of more casual proceedings convened on the spot by local commanders, or of limited investigations conducted by the soldiers who apprehended the prisoners. We also have newspaper accounts of prisoners being transferred from one prison to another, ostensibly for purposes of trial before a military commission. But without the records of those proceedings, it's hard to know what those were like and what actually happened. So the critics have a point, but I think, again, you have to look at the context of that criticism, because due process takes a concept from civilian law and imports it into the laws of war. And the emphasis on due process suggests that those executed were being punished for a particular action for which they had been found guilty. And that's not what Order 59 was about. Those executions were meant to deter future actions by other guerrillas by retaliating for past actions against prisoners that were already in federal hands. Order number 59 never claimed that the men who died were shot because they were being held accountable for their own private actions. Unable to lay hands on those who were responsible, Burbridge wanted to send a very grisly message to them to stop it. So this is the concept of retaliation. And retaliation was valid under the laws of war as they were understood at the time. In fact, retaliation is an accepted part of the law of war now. It allows an offended party who has been subject to an attack by an enemy that itself violates the laws of war to retaliate against enemy combatants in their hands as a way to deter further illegal attacks. Now that sentence is a mouthful, so let me simplify it. It allows the violations of the laws of war by party A to retaliate for a violation of the laws of war by party B. And in the Union understanding of things, the guerrilla attacks were illegal, and therefore retaliation was justified. This now brings us to the second point that was hammered home by Burbridge's foes. They insisted that the men executed were legitimate Confederate soldiers engaged in legitimate military action. They were not outlaws or guerrillas. This was just a convenient label to hide behind in order to carry out illegitimate violence against defenseless men who should have been treated as prisoners of war. But the legal context is important here. In response to his time fighting guerrillas in Missouri, Union General Henry Halleck asked the Columbia University legal scholar Francis Lieber to examine the status of guerrilla warfare under international law. And Lieber ended up producing an entire reformulation of the laws of war, the so-called Lieber Code, which was issued in April 1863. And that became the basis for Union actions in the war and for Burbridge's actions in Kentucky. And the Lieber Code laid out a fairly detailed set of requirements for combatants to be considered legitimate soldiers and thus subject to treatment as prisoners of war. The fighters had to be uniformed. They had to be under a chain of command with orders specifying some military objective and with the manpower necessary to accomplish that objective. It categorized those who did not meet those requirements under a variety of labels: armed prowler, squads of men without commission, war rebels. But it clarified that these men were liable to trial by military commissions and imprisonment and execution. So Adam Johnson, who was a leader of irregular forces in Western Kentucky for the Confederacy, didn't like this. And he complained of being branded by the Lincolnites as a guerrilla, insisting that he and his men were regular soldiers in the Confederate Army. But when he tried to claim this status, he went to parley with the Union commander in Louisville over Order number 59. And he sent a message to the Union commander in Louisville, who was Burbridge's subordinate. The commander responded, "No, I won't talk with you. Go away. You are heading a small force composed of irresponsible men distant from Confederate lines." Completely rejected the idea that he was a legitimate soldier. So it's true that among the list of those executed under Order 59, there are several who claimed membership in various Confederate military units and who were enlisted soldiers. But for Burbridge's detractors, this meant that all of them were legitimate combatants and should have been treated as prisoners of war. It didn't matter that they had been picked up behind the lines. It didn't matter that they had not been with their unit when they were apprehended. It didn't matter that they were not wearing the Confederate uniform when they were taken. In the eyes of Burbridge's critics, anyone who had enlisted in the Confederate Army at any point and in any place was deemed to be a legitimate Confederate soldier. But this was not how Burbridge or Burbridge's superior officers or the Lieber Code saw them. In the Union's understanding, the attacks carried out by small groups of armed men, not under the Confederacy's chain of command, were violations of the laws of war. The participants in those attacks, even if they were enlisted soldiers, were subject to apprehension and retaliation, including execution. As an officer in the Union Army and commander of Kentucky, Burbridge had a duty to enforce the law as it was understood by the Union. Charged with controlling the attacks of guerrillas and irregular forces in Kentucky, he undertook what were undeniably harsh measures, but they were measures that were within the bounds of the law. His actions were also largely within the bounds of military precedent, as these were understood by Union officers. Union commanders in various locations were bedeviled by Confederate guerrillas in various parts of the South where the army had occupied, as well as the border regions, not only in Kentucky, of course, but in Missouri and in West Virginia. And like Burbridge, these commanders used collective community punishments when the guerrillas could not be apprehended. In one of the most notorious instances in Missouri, they forcibly evacuated an entire section to clear out the guerrilla bands and their civilian supporters, and they resorted to summary executions. So Burbridge borrowed from an existing Union toolkit. So I said earlier with the title of this talk that it calls for a reconsideration of Burbridge. And in much greater detail in the book than I've done here, I have tried to prompt this reconsideration by looking very closely at the context in which the clampdown on civil liberties and the executions took place. But it's also pertinent to reconsider those who cultivated hatred of Burbridge and who attached the epithets of tyrant and butcher to him. These were largely returned Confederates supporting a lost cause view of their war and their allies among disaffected Kentucky Unionists. Now, historians have studied for a long time why white Kentuckians' embrace of the lost cause. And the lost cause, in summary, extols the gallantry of the Southern soldier, it criticizes the brutality of the Northern armies, celebrates the patriotic motivations behind the Southern struggle for independence, and it laments the misguided objective of freeing the enslaved people of the South. This view became dominant in Kentucky after the war. And the guy who put it best said back in 1926, the historian E. Merton Coulter, who wrote kind of a foundational work on the Civil War and the Reconstruction period in Kentucky, said, "Kentucky waited until the war was over to secede from the Union." So what Coulter described has since been studied by more recent historians who examine the way public memories of major events are constructed. And these writers focus on the work that's required to accomplish what Coulter described as Kentucky's secession. In other words, the way we remember our shared history doesn't just happen. It takes effort. And when an event is remembered in a particular way, it generally means that other ways of remembering that event have been pushed to the margins. What I submit is that a significant part of the effort to enshrine a lost cause inflected view of the war in Kentucky involved blackening the name and reputation of Burbridge. Hatred of Burbridge, in other words, was part of a pro-Confederate cultural memory project. So in addition to all the normal stuff of Confederate memory, statues to the dead, the celebration of Confederate leaders with ties to Kentucky, the regimental reunions and picnics, and the formation of local branches of Confederate heritage organizations, all of which happened in Kentucky, there were Burbridge-specific commemorations as well. Martyrs' monuments, which are Kentucky's particular contribution to Confederate monument building after the war. These martyrs' monuments were erected in various locales to commemorate those who had been executed under Order Number 59. In addition, reinterments of some of the victims of the executions took place with, whoops, I went too far. Hang on, gotta hit the right button. With processions and speeches, and stories of Burbridge's misdeeds were rehashed pretty consistently in the press and in local histories. Since you all are in Frankfort, in November 1870, Frankfort had one of these reinterment ceremonies for 3 of the men who had been killed under Burbridge's orders. And on the day of the ceremony, the governor proclaimed a statewide day of mourning. A 250-person escort processed alongside a, quote, beautiful white funeral car adorned with evergreens and white flowers. By the time the coffins made it to the cemetery, the city was almost entirely deserted, according to a press account, because of the crowd of citizens wanting to witness the reburial. Confederates from the nearby, or cadets from the nearby Kentucky Military Institute fired a 3-volley salute over the dead. The ceremony contained nothing of a political character, wrote the correspondent, but was a simple act of justice. Of course, a simple act of justice was meant to stand in marked contrast to the injustice that the men and the state had been subjected to under Burbridge. All of these commemorations, processions, stories, all of these were meant, in the words of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, to keep fresh the memory of Burbridge's infamy in the minds of white Kentuckians. And by keeping fresh the memory, it reminded them of the oppressions that they had suffered at the hands of the Union Army. It linked those oppressions to the much vaster suffering of the defeated South, and it energized the political criticism of the post-war Republican Party and the policies of Reconstruction. I want to give just one example of this Burbridge strategy that I find particularly interesting. In 1866, there was an election for the clerk of the Court of Appeals, which is a fairly minor office, and it pitted Edward Hobson, who was a former Union general who had served under Burbridge and was backed by the Republicans and the Conservative Union Party, against Alvin Duval, a Democrat who had fled the state early in the war when threatened with arrest by Burbridge for disloyal sentiments. But if you read the press coverage of this contest, you would be forgiven for not knowing who Duval's opponent was. Because in story after story, what mattered was what Burbridge had done to Duval and to Kentucky. When the Courier endorsed Duval, it wrote, "Thank God we have no Burbridge now to dictate to and rule over us." And another partisan wrote in another paper, "The election will turn upon the relative merits of Burbridge and Duval." And he warned voters that in the great case of Burbridge versus Duval, it will look very badly to see your name on the Burbridge side of the case. So the sins of Burbridge, and thus by extension Hobson, were then also tied to the post-war sins of the Republican Party. Summarizing the crackdown on civil liberties and the executions under Burbridge, a Lexington paper wrote that the supporters of Hobson included every Burbridge man, every Freedmen's Bureau man, every Civil Rights Bill man, every man who is for the pending Negro Equality Amendment, by which he means the 14th Amendment. And needless to say, Hobson lost the election convincingly. This constant recycling of grievances against Burbridge's wartime policies, the smearing of his reputation and that of anyone closely associated with him, and the linking of those wartime policies to the Republican Party and its post-war policies of Reconstruction, all helped push white Kentuckians' sympathies in a distinctly pro-Confederate direction. And it was very successful. The Democratic Party, led by ex-Confederates, came to control state government for the next several decades. Burbridge was eventually hounded from the state, and white Kentuckians firmly embraced the lost cause version of the Civil War. However, Kentucky is now maybe moving on from the lost cause. Some Confederate monuments have come down, and current day historians have been thoroughly challenging the rosy view of Confederacy contained in earlier works of Kentucky history. So maybe it is time to move on from the general contempt for Burbridge as well. If we place his wartime actions in the proper context, we find that much of the hatred directed at him was a reflection of white Kentuckians' hatred of the end of slavery. His critics expected Burbridge to facilitate a debate over the legitimacy of the wartime policy of emancipation, and they were angered when he insisted that there was no debate to be had. The wartime emergency demanded a certain standard of loyalty, and if that was not met, he was charged with enforcing the consequences. The executions, as repugnant as they are to modern sensibilities, were legal responses to an illegal insurgency convulsing the state. They were in line with policies pursued by Union commanders in other areas, and they were sanctioned and approved by Burbridge's commanding officers. The attempts to transform them into illegitimate military murders carried out by an aspiring dictator was largely a post-war ideological ploy by those who were eager to portray Union wartime measures and Republican post-war policies in the worst light possible. The long hatred of Burbridge was a measure of that ideological success. And the current reinterpretation of that ideology may finally pull the black cloak off Burbridge and allow modern students of Kentucky's Civil War history to gain a new perspective on the most hated man in Kentucky. So that's all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Brad. Enjoyed that. I'm going to throw a comment in.
Absolutely.
And that I always find it interesting that all the things that the Union did is remembered, and all the things the Confederacy did is disremembered. You go over to Simpsonville, and there's the monument to the, can't remember the number of African-American troops killed that were killed. We have throughout the state of Kentucky various. You have the tale of Quantrell. He rides down the road. He meets some Union guys who are in furlough. They talk, and then he pulls out and shoots them. And this is held up as a neat thing. Look what he did. So you got this constant dual look at what happens in Kentucky. Acts that by one side some are legitimate, are criticized, and other ones that are basically totally illegal are held up as they did right. It is strange.
And I think that's the kind of goes to the point of the people who study this kind of memory, is that all memory, all public memory of things involves some remembering and some forgetting. So you forget certain things and you remember others, and certain things get elevated and certain things get pushed to the side. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about. There's a process that went forward where some things were remembered and some things were, as you say, misremembered.
Yeah. You mentioned about what happened in Missouri, but nobody goes and says, well, what happened right before that? The raid upon Lawrenceburg, Kansas, and then the killing of all the civilians.
Right.
So this is a response. Everybody forgets the preview that happened.
Yeah.
We just had a question come up, and I didn't have a chance to read the question.
I did see it. He asked about Burbridge's post-war life.
Okay.
For a long time, it was said, and you'll read in a lot of histories, that Burbridge was never able to set foot in Kentucky again after the war because he was so hated. That is not technically true. For 6 or 7 years, almost, it was early 1870, 72, 73. But for those first 8 years, he was active in Republican politics, and he was in the state frequently. And he worked actually as a claims attorney in Covington for several years before he finally moved out. And he moved out after his wife died, after both his brothers had been shot in disputes about his legacy, and after a number of threats had been made against him. So he eventually moved to Washington, D.C. to pursue patronage appointments with D.C. He was never successful in those because every time he came close, a Kentucky politician would intervene and say, no, he's not getting a position with the federal government. And so he lived in D.C. for a few years, and then in the late 1870s, he married a rich Philadelphia widow, went on a European honeymoon for 2 years, and then moved to New York. And he eventually died in Brooklyn in 1894. and he is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. So that's a brief digest of his post-war life. He didn't get a federal pension, and he never did get a federal position, though he applied for many, many, many federal positions. And then there was a second question. Oh yeah, I will be, if you all, for those of you who are Scott Countyans, I will be in Scott County at the Historical Society in October. And it will, I agree, it will be interesting to have the local people hear the talk, because he was from Stamping Ground. He went to school not at Georgetown College, but at the time there was a preparatory academy that was part of the college, and he went to school there for a few years. So he has strong local connections to Scott County, and I'll be interested to see how the memory of him has been shaped in Scott County.
Anybody else out there want to unmute and make a comment, ask a question? Feel free to unmute yourself. Well, I don't see anybody else.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
How did you happen to come to this subject to write a book? What was there about it that intrigued you?
Well, I did another book 10 years ago, because I'm so prolific. I produce books once a decade. And in that book, which was about two women, one a slave woman, one her mistress. The slave woman escapes, and they correspond while she's living in Canada. And that covered the Civil War period. And that was where I first encountered Burbridge. I had not heard the name before. And so I learned about him. And the more I read, it kind of became a question of, how do you say it, like conventional wisdom. Everybody said the same thing about him. Everybody said that he was this horrible tyrant, aspiring dictator, bad person, and that things like that often intrigued me. And I looked into it and kind of thought, yeah, maybe he's gotten a little bit of a lost cause inflected bad rap. And so that's when I started investigating it.
Question about relationship Burbridge and Bull Nelson in Kentucky's memory.
I think Bull Nelson is remembered more fondly than Burbridge. I mean, Nelson is, I think, remembered as a hothead, as a guy you wouldn't want to serve under, as an unpredictable guy who would get angry at you at any moment. But Burbridge, but he did not undertake the kind of widespread oppression that Burbridge is tagged with. And especially, Bull Nelson is not tagged with the emancipation problem. I mean, he could leave slavery alone. And it was really that, I think, that gives Burbridge the edge over Nelson. In fact, there is a section in the book where Burbridge had been promoted to brigadier general, but he doesn't have a command yet. So he's told to report to Nelson as part of the defenses for Louisville during the Confederate invasion of 1862. And Nelson tells him to go out and set up some defenses. And Burbridge says, well, how would you like them set up, sir? And he goes, damn you, I don't care how they're set up, just set them up. And so Burbridge goes out and does it, and then Nelson takes a tour of them, and he starts saying, oh, this is done all wrong. You're such an idiot. And he calls Burbridge this name, bad names. And Burbridge is he's a 19th century Kentuckian. He has a pretty prickly sense of honor. So he pulls out a revolver and points it at Nelson's head and says, take it back or I'll kill you. And Nelson kind of goes, oh, ho, dear boy, don't be so quick to react. Put the gun away. I didn't mean anything by it. And then they go on. So it was shortly after that Jeff Davis, treated similarly by Bull Nelson, actually goes to the Galt House and shoots him dead. So Nelson had a lot of enemies, but they were enemies within among the people he served with.
Doesn't Jeff Davis at the very end of the war sort of take Burbridge's position in Kentucky?
No, that's so the successor to Burbridge is John Palmer, who's an Illinois abolitionist, and he pretty
I
much.
thought Palmer is succeeded by Jeff Davis. I could be wrong.
That's possible. It's possible. Because I pretty much stopped looking after Palmer because Palmer leaves, I think, towards the end of 1865, and by that time, slavery's, the 13th Amendment has been passed, and slavery's been pretty much destroyed. It is quite possible that Jeff Davis succeeds him. I just don't know.
Jefferson Davis is an interesting person. They never convict him of Bull Nelson's murder,
No.
but when the wars are with, he becomes a non-person within the U.S. Army. He's always been given these little staff jobs, although he does end the Modoc War, but outside of that, he's off somewhere.
Is that right? I didn't know he was in the Modoc War.
Yeah, he comes in after Canby's killed.
Oh, okay.
And as the finish, he's first governor of Alaska.
Oh,
He's
really?
up there? And yeah, he's doing all kind of crazy.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
need to read Jefferson Davis in Blue.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for the recommendation.
Anything else out there, good people? Well, I thank you. Once again, I enjoyed this, learning about this part of Kentucky history that nobody likes to talk about. And it's true, we were fighting to preserve the Union, as you said, the day before Lincoln was elected president, not the Union of 1864, of 1865. And that we didn't like that. And I liked your little talk about the Daughters of Confederacy monuments, the martyr monuments. It's up there in our Frankfort Cemetery, up by Daniel Boone's grave is where it is located. So if you go up there, the Midway Monument is on the southwest side of the town.
Yeah.
In the little cemetery there. So the Daughters of Confederacy, we're our own little terrorist group of the day. Okay. Thank you again. Thank you for Diane doing this. And the Capital City Museum, thanks you for coming. And stop by our museum downtown and take a look around. It is a nice little place that we've upgraded recently.
Great.
And thank you, Brad, for coming with us.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Asher, for your wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. I hope everyone else has too. If anyone's interested in checking the book out, we of course do have it in our collection at Paul Sawyer. So feel free and come take a look at that. Take it home with you.
And if you want to buy it, poor Richard has it.
Oh,
there
great.
you go.
Thank you.
And but thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with us this evening. And thank you to Charles, as always, for coordinating another great program. So with that, I wish you all a wonderful night, and I hope to see you at another Paul Sawyer program soon.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.